Well, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who can hear me upstairs, there are still some seats downstairs that you might want to come and join us. You might want to come and join us downstairs, but what a great house. And I want to, as director of Roosevelt House, I'm Harold Holzer. I want to welcome all of you to the home of not only Franklin Roosevelt, but two incredibly powerful women, Sarah Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, whose legacy we honor here every day as well. I am particularly thrilled to welcome this panel as someone who has worked in the intersection of the women's movement and politics for a long, long time, beginning about 45 years ago. I know you won't believe that because of how young I look. I can't tell you how excited I am by the events of this afternoon and this evening, and how much I think there is to learn and how much I'm looking forward to learning. Particularly grateful that the nor'easter that we got so many calls about today has been postponed by a higher power until tomorrow. As my old boss, Bella Abzug, would say, God is a woman after all, and we thank her for the delay. And that's the origin of my own interest. I was Bella Abzug's press secretary when she became the first woman to run for the Senate from New York State, a race that ultimately descended into how feminine she was and how overly strong she was, strident, and all the words that were ascribed to her painfully, with her record obscured and the interpretation of whether she was an appropriate woman becoming the major issue. Nonetheless, she broke ground as the first woman to run for mayor, and I was her press secretary again, equally painful, in 1977. The same issues, the same arguments. Much has changed. One of our guests upstairs said, as depressed as I get occasionally, we've come a long way. We have a long way to go, and I am particularly grateful to Professor Virginia Valian, who had the idea of convening not one but two discussions, an analysis and a leadership panel this evening to attack the questions, why did Clinton lose and how, indeed, women can win. Virginia is the head of Hunter College's Gender Equity Project. It's distinguished professor in the psychology department. She is daring to initiate a discussion to speak frankly about what faces us and our sisters and our daughters and our grandchildren. And Virginia, I am really grateful to you for doing this, and we are honored to have you. Please let me turn it over to Professor Virginia Valian.
Thank you and welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people here. The day after the 2016 election, my colleague Sarit Golub asked me, why isn't anybody talking about sexism? And that night, I wrote to Laurie Rudman, one of our speakers, and said, Laurie, I want to organize a symposium in which we will talk about sexism and its role in the 2016 election. And no sooner had I signed off than I got a reply immediately from Laurie saying, yes, absolutely, just tell me when and where. So there's been a lot of enthusiasm about this two-part event. This part, the scholars speak, and the evening, the leaders speak. I organized this event with Director Holzer and with Bill Goldstein, the public programming curator, and Rafael Munoz, the manager of academic programs and partnerships. We're all grateful for the support of the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Andrew Polsky, the acting provost of Hunter College, Lon Kaufman, and the president of the college, Jennifer Rabb. When I wrote to her telling her that we wanted to have this event, and the second part we thought would need to be in the K which we could not afford the regular rates of, she replied back immediately saying, "We'll make it work. It sounds like a great idea." So it's been wonderful to have so much support from everybody at Hunter for this event. In your program, you have inserts that present exit poll data on how people voted and data on the numbers of men and women in state and federal legislatures. Today's panelists will take us behind the numbers to explanations based on their current research. The talks address the roles of modern sexism, patriarchal beliefs, and race, as well as people's unwillingness to accept unpalatable evidence. We see the present moment as affording many opportunities to revitalize democracy, of which the Women's March on January 21st was a notable example. Whatever the issue, healthcare, immigration, income inequality, there are actions you can take within your community, your state, and in the U.S. as a whole. One action, out of many, is to increase the number of women in leadership positions, including positions in government. Why do I emphasize women? Because their relative absence is not good for democracy. According to Jennifer Lawless, one researcher on women in politics, women in the Senate were responsible for ultimately ending the government shutdown in fall of 2013 by working in a nonpartisan way. Women aim for consensus and compromise across party lines. Those are qualities Hillary Clinton was admired for when she was a senator. Women were also largely responsible for passing the budget and the transportation bill, among others. Data from the sciences similarly show that having women on a team improves the team's problem solving, no matter what the problem is. For example, when women are members of patent teams, those patents are cited more often. But women are less likely to run for office than men are, partly because they are recruited less and partly because they less often consider running for office. When they do run for office, women currently have as good a chance of getting elected as men do. That's in part because more and more voting occurs along partisan lines. So people will vote for a woman if she belongs to a party that they support. Electing women, putting women in leadership roles helps up and down the line. Electing women to city council positions is related to having more women as mayors. Electing women to state legislatures is one way to help increase the representation of women at the federal level, because about half of the national senators and representatives first served at a state level. As your insert shows, women are underrepresented in state legislatures. Women are also underrepresented as mayors and governors. So this is something that we can fix on a local level. A fourth grade girl who was asked why the sexes didn't play soccer together at recess said, "The boys never ask us to play. Then, when we do play, only boys are chosen to be captains, and girls don't get the ball passed to them very often. And when a girl scores a goal, the boys don't cheer." This quote, with terms suitably transposed, could describe adult professional life as well as fourth grade recess. If you're a woman, actively expand your participation in activities that will revitalize democracy, including developing leadership skills. If you're a man, cheer when the woman scores a goal. Our first speakers this afternoon are Maya Godbole and Noelle Malvar, speaking on how sexism shaped the 2016 election. They are both PhD students in basic and applied social psychology at the CUNY Graduate Center. Maya Godbole studies the influence of sexism on women's motivation and achievement and ways that women can get ahead in traditionally masculine domains. Noelle Malvar studies the influence of beliefs of racial and gender inequality on everyday conversations and in political decision-making. The way that this afternoon program will run, and I have to warn you, we will stop on the dot at 5:30 so that people can get from here to the evening program. So the way the format will work is all of the speakers will speak, then we'll have a discussion among the speakers, and then we'll take brief questions from the audience. So let's begin with Maya and Noelle. Okay, this worked beautifully. Let's try this one. There we go. Okay.
Thank you, Virginia. We're so excited to be here today to share some of our data with you. First off, we'd like to make a couple acknowledgments to the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute and the Gender Equity Project for their support with our research, and to Roosevelt House for having us here today. So let's talk about the elephant in the 2016 presidential election. And you guessed it, sexism. As Virginia mentioned, when explaining why Hillary Clinton lost in November, media were quick to cite emails and a poorly run campaign, but there was very little dialogue around sexism. And when there was, media seemed to be really torn about whether or not it played a role in this election. Some sources claimed that it played a major role, while others denied that it played any effect at all. So, in the next 8 minutes, we'd like to address two questions. One, how does sexism influence how people view leaders? And two, did sexism play a role in the 2016 election? To talk about sexism today, let's first define what it means to be sexist in our society today. When we think about sexism, we often bring to mind this very old-fashioned type that's very blatant, and it's centered around this belief that men are superior to women in certain domains. For example, an old-fashioned sexist might remark, "Women just aren't built for the pressure of being a politician." However, sexism has become more subtle in its manifestation over time, and there are now these more innocuous beliefs that permeate within our culture. And they may even be seen as acceptable sometimes. Today we're talking about modern sexism. This is a more subtle belief centered around the idea that sexism is done, that sexism is no longer a problem. So a modern sexist might show antagonism towards women who rally for change or who want equality, and they might show a lack of support for any kind of policies devoted to helping or supporting women. A modern sexist might remark, "Women now have the same opportunities as men in politics." So to answer our two questions, we conducted a research study, and we collected data from an online sample in the months prior to the election. We assessed our participants on demographic information, including race, gender, age, and political perspective in terms of social issues, the economy, and foreign affairs. Participants were randomly selected to rate one of 4 individuals on 64 traits. These individuals were the ideal president, or their perception of the ideal president, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton. To show you what I mean, participants were shown a slider scale and asked to rate from not typical to typical how typical each characteristic is for that individual. In this case, Hillary Clinton. The 64 traits were divided into 3 categories: stereotypically masculine traits, for example, analytic and ambitious; stereotypical feminine traits, like emotional and helpful to others; and leadership traits, such as competent and charismatic. We also assessed our participants on their attitudes, including modern sexism, favorability toward Clinton and Trump, and we also asked them, if the election were today, who would you vote for?
Okay, so what did we find? We gathered information for a total of 874 participants with an average age of 38 years old. The majority of them were white, and we had a fairly even split between genders, with 53% female. For their political perspective, 44% had liberal views, while 18% endorsed more conservative beliefs. And then 33% were right in the middle, or independents. So for the modern sexism score, we gave them the modern sexism scale, which ranged from values of 1 to 7, with 7 being the most sexist. And for our sample, our average was 3.0. Also, I want to say that there was a significant difference between men and women, such that males were significantly more sexist than females. Okay, so let's look at the top 5 traits that people said characterized Obama, Trump, and Clinton the most. And as well as the bottom 5 that they said least describe these individuals. So we can see that there are some similarities. Everyone was rated as confident. Trump and Clinton were both rated as competitive and ambitious, but I want to bring your focus to 2 things. So first, for the top 5 traits, the majority of these traits are masculine. For Clinton and Trump, they're all masculine, right? And then for the bottom 5 traits, the opposite is true, such that the majority of these traits are feminine. For Trump, they were all feminine. And for Clinton, they were, people said she was not gentle, not tender, and then the rest of the traits centered around this idea of being honest or trustworthy. Okay, so how does this all relate to what people said were traits that describe an ideal president? For the ideal president, as we would expect, the top 5 traits were all leadership traits. So they wanted, or they think that a leader has leadership, integrity, intelligence, is competent, and reliable. We also scored the masculine and feminine traits that Maya described earlier to see what characterized an ideal president more. And we found that people saw the ideal president as significantly more masculine than feminine. For the bottom 5 traits, the same pattern holds. So there are significantly more, or the majority are feminine traits in this bottom 5 category. When we looked at the relationship between how they rated the ideal president to their modern sexism scores, we saw that people higher in modern sexism preferred less feminine traits in their ideal president. So the higher you go in that scale, the less feminine traits you want in your ideal president. So how did this manifest in the 2016 election? We found that sexism predicted unfavorable attitudes toward Clinton over and above demographics and political perspective. So what this means is when we controlled for gender, age, race, as well as whether they're liberals or Democrats, modern sexism was still a significant factor. We also saw that those higher in sexism were 1.5 times more likely to vote for Donald Trump. So going from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, or a unit increase in that modern sexism scale translated to a 1.5 times increase in their likelihood of voting for Trump over Clinton. Okay, so to go back to our original questions, how does sexism influence how people view leaders? we see that modern sexism influences how people perceive the ideal leader. In particular, people higher in modern sexism prefer less feminine traits in their ideal president. To the question of whether sexism played a role in the 2016 election, yes. Our data suggests that it did. Okay, so what can we do with this information? And as basic and applied psychologists, we always want to translate our research findings in the real world. First, we can inform people about subtle types of sexism and their effects. So we can be conscious of the fact that it's not just old-fashioned sexism, but also this subtle, seemingly innocuous type that can also have significant detrimental effects to the way we perceive and treat women. Next, we can be aware of the language used to talk about women and leadership roles. So we all have interactions in our lives where we interact with female bosses or women leaders, and we can be conscious of how the media or the public or even ourselves of how we talk about them. And lastly, we can support female leaders whose values we agree with, even if sometimes we don't like them. Thank you.
I think we have to go to the beginning.
Oh, we were at the end, sorry.
Yeah, we were at the end.
So our next speaker is Professor Laurie Rudman, speaking on backlash in the 2016 presidential election. Professor Rudman is professor of psychology at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Her research examines the challenges of female leadership. Her honors include a National Research Service Award from the National Institutes of Health, the Carolyn Wood Sharif Award, and she is a two-time winner of the Gordon Allport Prize for the Best Paper on Intergroup Relations. Dr. Rudman.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Virginia, for organizing this event and inviting me to be a part of it. So I'm going to start out by reminding us of gender double standards, but also why Hillary Clinton should have won. Imagine a woman who showed up unprepared to a presidential debate, sniffling like a coke addict and interrupting her opponent 70 times. Let's further imagine that she's had 5 kids by 3 men, was a repeated adulterer, had multiple bankruptcies, paid 0 federal taxes, and rooted for the housing crisis in which many thousands of families lost their homes. Wait, there's more. She's never held any elected office in her life. Instead, she lost to America's biggest sexist. How on earth could that have happened? One comedian tweeting that night had an answer. What I've learned so far tonight, America is way more sexist than it is racist. And it's pretty fucking racist. So how on earth could it be that a woman who is supremely qualified was defeated by a man who's so unqualified? I'm going to talk to you today about women's dilemma. To overcome beliefs that they're not fit for leadership, beliefs that stem from the fact that men have always held more leadership roles than women, so they're the prototype for leadership, women must proudly display their achievements. They have to get over that first hurdle by showing that they can do the job. A great way to show that you can do the job is to assert your confidence and your competence and be proud of your achievements. The problem is that when women do that, they risk backlash, social and economic penalties for breaking gender rules. Backlash handicaps women when they compete for leadership. Why? What's not to like about strong, self-confident women? It turns out that accomplished women threaten patriarchy. Okay, it's an obvious answer. That's why they suffer backlash. We found in 5 experiments evidence for this. It effectively, what happens with backlash, it denies female leaders the power to weaken stereotypes that women can't lead and to inspire other female vanguards. It effectively renders them invisible so they don't have power to change the system. For defenders of patriarchy, threats to the gender system are vehemently resisted, as we saw in 2016. So ladies and gentlemen, Hillary Clinton is a poster woman for backlash, and it was really out of control in 2016. So this begs a vital question: why is patriarchy deemed worthy of defense? What's so great about patriarchy? To find out, we conducted a study of US adults in early December. We gave them a forced choice. Which of the 2 major party presidential candidates did you prefer, Clinton or Trump? And then we measured gender system justification. That's how we assess defending patriarchy. But also, how much do you like social hierarchies? We call that social dominance orientation. And gender essentialism, beliefs that biology causes gender differences. But inspired by the 2016 election, we also measured social Darwinism. This is the belief that humans, like plants and animals, are governed by natural laws dictating survival of the fittest. Social Darwinists view life as a fierce competition in which ruthlessness is required for success, also known as jungle law. In 2016, Trump and his supporters displayed this worldview. Trump openly admired brutal dictators and smeared his opponents as weak and pathetic while offering force as the best solution to any problem. Undocumented immigrants, deport them all and build a wall. Jihadist terror, torture and murder them and their families for good measure. Dissent, beat up protesters, kick them out the door. Growing diversity of American citizens, screw political correctness. Social Darwinism was used to justify white male supremacy and ruthless capitalism over 100 years ago. By spawning eugenics, it was largely discredited, not least by the Holocaust. But it lives on in our ethos, notably in business. So here's sample items from our social Darwinism scale. The fittest members of our society naturally rise to the top. Policies that promote weaker groups to positions of power threaten the natural order, think affirmative action. Social reformers who want to make us all equal just do not understand that people are by nature unequal. Social Darwinism might be the best defense of patriarchy because it uses biology to justify hierarchies. Gender equality is neither possible or desirable. Results of our post-election research supported this hypothesis. First, confirming what we already knew, that people who defend patriarchy resist female leaders. Only being a conservative and defending patriarchy predicted rejecting Clinton in favor of Trump. Other demographics, like gender, for instance, faded away. But why? Why is patriarchy defended? Second, we found that social Darwinism predicted defending patriarchy better than social dominance orientation or gender essentialism. And third, we replicated these findings with a Rutgers undergraduate sample. Social Darwinism justifies patriarchy, and defending patriarchy motivates backlash against strong, self-confident women, which helps to explain not only why Clinton lost, but also the broader appeal of Trumpism. It boils down to the belief that certain people are meant to dominate others. Often it is the wealthy who are meant to rule, but it extends to the idea that white people should dominate people of color, that men should dominate women, that humans should dominate the earth, and that Donald Trump should dominate any opponent. For many people, this worldview is antithetical to democracy, underscored by the Clinton campaign slogan, "Stronger Together." And while she lost the election, we cannot forget her historic achievement. She won the popular vote bigly. Nonetheless, not enough voters supported her, in part because she was viewed as unlikable and trustworthy, as we just saw. That's the dilemma that female leaders face, damned if they act like men and damned if they don't. Backlash is a thief that robs women of their ability to effectively compete. The fact that defending patriarchy motivates backlash is deeply disturbing, but perhaps not surprising. After all, humans have justified patriarchy for millennia, whether by God's grand design or evolution's grand design. The solution is to lift women's status to be equal to men. Step one, we must pass the Equal Rights Amendment as a constitutional bulwark against capricious legislation. The silver lining in all this is young women are finally waking up to the need to organize and resist to protect their rights, because we really are not just stronger together, but fiercer together. Thank you, and thank you to women everywhere who shattered gender rules and the glass ceiling.
Thank you very much, Laurie. And just in the nick of time is our third speaker, who's been teaching at the Graduate Center and got here as soon as he could. Charles Tien will be speaking on racializing the gender gap, Trump, and the women's vote. Professor Tien is professor of political science at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He was a Fulbright Scholar in American politics at Renmin University in Beijing. He has taught classes on American politics, women and minorities in politics, voting and elections, American foreign policy, research methods, and polling. His work has appeared most recently in Presidential Studies Quarterly and the International Journal of Forecasting. Charles, I'm so glad to see you.
All right, just in the nick of time, thank you for having me and inviting me to participate in this panel. I wish I could have been here at the beginning to hear some of the other speakers, but I got here as quickly as I could. So what I want to do today is talk about the 2016 presidential election and the women's vote and how it factored into the Trump victory in 2016. And I want to provide, I guess, some broader context to the women's vote first, and then get into possible explanations for why women, white women in particular, voted the way that they did. So in political science, we have identified, after it was pointed out to us in the media, that there is a gender gap in voting in American politics, and that gender gap has existed since 1980. And in exit polls this year, right, we learned that 54% of all women voted for Clinton. And so what this figure does is it basically, right, takes that 54% and projects backwards and shows you, right, what percentage of women have voted for the Democratic candidate all the way back until 1976. And there you can see, right, in 76, vote between men and women essentially the same. And then in 1980, you see that gap, and then that gap has persisted and grown since that time. So this is one version of the gender gap, and you can see that in 1980, in every presidential election after that, a greater percentage of women than men have voted for the Democratic candidate. And you can see that the last time that women preferred a Republican candidate was in 1988. In 1996. This is the next slide that actually looks at vote choice by white women. Okay, so what I want to look at is break down that women's vote and to shed possible light, I think, on what that gender gap in the last slide was hiding, which is that the women's vote is actually quite diverse by racial group. Okay, and so in this year, right, the exit polls told us that 43% of women voted for Clinton. That's right, 43% of women in 2016 voted for Clinton, 52% voted for Trump. Right, so the gender gap here, I think, masks a changing demographic of voters, and we've all heard that, projections of, 2040 or somewhere between 2040 and 2050 that whites will be a minority in America at that time. And what you've seen already is that as a percentage of the electorate, white women have been decreasing slowly but steadily. So 2016 exit polls showed that white women made up 37% of the electorate. And this has been a drop since 2000 when women made up 42% of the electorate. And that was when 51% voted for Bush and 49% voted for Gore. So you have a declining share of the electorate amongst white women. And then also, right, you have a gender gap in preference amongst all women voters. And so this gender gap, right, that you see of women preferring Democrats more than men is essentially driven by minority women. So more minority women have been entering the electorate, and these minority women have a strong preference for Democratic candidates. So in this election, 2016, 94% of African American women voted for Clinton, right? So that's 94% compared to 43% for white women. Hispanic women or Latina women, 69% of Hispanic women voted for Clinton. Again, 69% compared to 43%, right? So those are big differences. And then amongst Asian and other women, American Indians and mixed race women, 61% voted for Clinton. So again, this is to compare, I can't say it enough, I guess. I think we're all surprised by it, right? Compared to the 43% of white women who voted for Clinton. But, right, this should be no surprise. So this looks at white women voting from 1972 to 2012. And you can see here the clear trend is that white women prefer Republican presidential candidates. So in 1972, right, 67% of white women voted for the Republican candidate, and this gap, right, essentially persists until today. In the mid-90s, you see where Clinton in 1996 won a majority of the white women vote, but that's really the only time that a majority of white women have voted for the Democratic candidate, since the 1970s. That other year in 1992, you can see that once you add the third-party Ross Perot vote, you have a majority of white women voters favoring the non-democratic choices. This looks at the same time period and looks at party identification of white women, right? So to put this in a broader context, you can see that there's been a movement in the last few election cycles. It's the red line that you're looking at, right? And that's the percentage of white women identifying with the Republican Party. And you can see that that number has grown over the last few election cycles, where in 2012 you had 50% of white women identifying with the Republican Party. The data for 2016 aren't available yet, right? So this data is based on American National Election Studies data, and that's being essentially collected and analyzed and should be released probably within the next couple of months. So the data source here is a little different, but this is, according to political scientists, the gold standard for public opinion polling. So these data come from surveys that are done every 2 or 4 years based on a national sample, face-to-face interviewing with quite high response rates. So according to political scientists, this is right as accurate data as we have. Okay, so now looking at the 2016 vote. So there's been a growing number of studies and political scientists suggesting that the election of Barack Obama heightened racial tensions in America, right? So there was a belief of some after the 2008 election, right, that we would enter a post-racial period, that with the election of an African-American candidate, right, racial tensions would actually reduce. But the most recent studies have shown that the opposite seems to have been happening, right? So that everything that is affiliated with Barack Obama, right, support for health care, support for the Democratic Party, right, if you ask people, right, about their support for even Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, before they became affiliated with the Obama administration, how people felt about race had nothing to do with how they felt then about health care, how they felt about Hillary Clinton, how they felt about Joe Biden. After 2008, 10, 12, 14, 16, now the most recent data show that how people feel about health care is, right, explained about essentially by their racial attitudes. Okay, so the more, right, racist attitudes that they exhibit, the more they oppose health care, the more racist attitudes that they exhibit, the less they support Hillary Clinton. So if this body of literature is correct, which I think it is, then I think 2016 should also be a racialized election, right? So any observer could tell you that race was a prominent issue in this election, starting with Trump's comments about immigrants, about the Muslim ban, okay, and on and on and on. So, so the hypothesis or the proposition here that I wanted to test was Trump's support driven by, right, racial resentment, what we call racial resentment. And this is a concept that political scientists came up with to explain the nature of racism after the Jim Crow era. Right, so the nature of racism in this era and in the current area, political scientists believe, right, is the belief that that if blacks would only work harder, right, they would be able to do just as well as whites. That, you know, other minority groups in the past have been able to overcome prejudice, and if blacks did the same, then they would be able to succeed as well, right? Essentially, that if blacks would only try harder, there aren't problems of discrimination. It's right the behavior of blacks that explains their situation, and so this is the right. There are a series of questions that surveys ask to try to capture, right, people's level of racial resentment. And so what I looked at here in the 2016 data, there was a pilot data released in January of 2016. And so I looked at how people felt about Trump, right, and whether race had any role to play in how they felt about Trump. So you would think that things that, right, would explain people's support for Trump might have to do with economics, right? So we heard about this election as being, right, that white voters who've been struggling economically, right? Those were the reasons why they were supporting Trump. Simple conservatives, right? So conservatives, of course, being more Republican, would be more supportive of Trump. So after factoring in conservatism, party identification, even feelings towards Hillary Clinton, so maybe people were just supporting Trump because they didn't like Hillary, right? Feelings about Muslims, feelings about feminists, whether they had a college degree or not. So controlling for all these other factors, the most powerful predictor of people's support for Trump was actually this measure of racial resentment. Right, so the higher levels of racism that voters expressed, the more likely they were to support Trump. So that's the synopsis of the 2016 election, at least in terms of explaining white women's vote. Might give a prescription for how women win, right? Okay. So that was another part of my job today. And when I showed my daughter and my wife the lineup for today, my daughter immediately reacted, well, why are you the only male, right, amongst all these? And then my wife said, and you're supposed to tell them what, and you're supposed to tell everybody, right, what women are supposed to do. And she said, they're going to love you for that. So here's my best try. Here goes. Let's see. So I'm again going to rely on the political science literature. And I think, right, for women to win, literature says women have to run. So studies that have looked at the advantages that male candidates have in terms of incumbency, right, fundraising, okay, likelihood of winning, there are no clear advantages for male candidates over female candidates. And so the conclusion in the political science literature is that the reason why today we have, 21 female senators, and I think here I was looking up, and 83 women House members, right? So that's about 20% of these bodies, and as you know, that's far short of the 50%, right, that women make up in the population. Well less than 50%. And so the political science literature concludes that more women have to run for office, right? And this starts at the lower levels. So the way to make it to the Senate, the way to make it to the House is through the PTA and the school board and the city council. And at all levels, right, the findings have been that way more men run than women. So right, the conclusion of most political science textbooks on gender and politics is when women run, women win. So, and Hillary, of course, won the popular vote. Everybody knows that, except for maybe Donald Trump. So, there's evidence to that, and I think how women win is by running for office.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Corinne Moss-Racusin, speaking on just locker room banter, denying evidence of sexism. Dr. Moss-Racusin is assistant professor of psychology at Skidmore College. She studies the ways in which stereotypes contribute to inequality within different kinds of institutions. Her research has appeared in Science, Nature, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and is also regularly cited by the media, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, ABC News, and the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you. All right, hello everybody. Thank you, Virginia, again for organizing this panel. I just think this kind of work is more important than ever, and I can't help but note that most folks on the panel have sort of spontaneously worn black, perhaps emblematic of just how serious these problems are that we're grappling with. Or it's New York. We'll never know. They're confounded, but it's one possibility. So I, again, have been thrilled to be here and looking forward to this event today for many reasons, least of which, short personal tangent, my grandmother graduated from this institution, from Hunter College, back in 1936. So here she is, and certainly, thank you. An inspiration to me, but this is a little bit of a homecoming for me, so I'm thrilled to be able to be here and part of this community today. So I want to tell you about some of my work, not only identifying the role of sexism and gender bias, but how people respond to evidence of sexism, even pretty clear experimental scientific evidence. So Laurie's already shown you some of these delightful products, and I'm going to just show you a sampling of some of the, unfortunately, tamer anti-Hillary Clinton products and slogans that really characterized quite a bit of the tone of this campaign. not least of which we saw in then candidate Trump, now President Trump. And I think his case study is particularly relevant and important for us today. So Trump says things over the course of his years in the spotlight to this effect: nobody respects women more than me, right? And last week was International Women's Day, and we got this tweet from President Trump: I have tremendous respect for women, blah, blah, blah. So here's his forward face, right? And yet we know from this election cycle that there are numerous instances where he does not live up to this characterization that he has of his own attitudes towards women. So again, this is just a sampling, but we've seen him say really negative things about women's physical appearance. I'm not going to read all of these for you. You're probably familiar with many of them, but here's his extremely hostile response to Megyn Kelly, the woman who moderated one of the first Republican debates. Fairly unsavory. Classically characterizing Hillary Clinton as such a nasty woman when she disagreed with one of his policy points. And then perhaps most notoriously, this really hostile and aggressive comment that he gave on tape. So how, as president, as someone in the public spotlight, how do you justify, how do you have these two things exist at the same time? No one respects women more than me, and yet here I am in all these ways not respecting women, right? And we know, what was his response? This was just locker room talk. What he's doing here is certainly minimizing the seriousness of what he said, but also in a lot of ways denying that he's sexist. So denying some evidence of sexism. So what we've been curious about is what happens when you simply present people with the types of data that we've seen already today? Is that enough? Is showing people this kind of evidence sufficient? Or might we be concerned about what they do with that information? Do they push back? Do they hear it and change their views, or do they say, no, I have a way of rationalizing this or being reactive against it? So that's the work that I want to tell you about briefly in my time today. So scientific researchers have quite a large body of fairly straightforward, robust evidence of gender bias. And I'm going to tell you about one simple study that follows the same paradigm as many experiments in this literature, so that we can go from there in terms of thinking about how people respond to these data. So here's a study that came out of my lab. We were interested in how science faculty members would respond to lab manager applicants. So we held the qualifications absolutely consistent. They rated a student who had allegedly applied to be a lab manager in the US sometime within this year. And the only thing we varied across conditions was the alleged gender of that applicant. So they read about Jennifer or they read about John, and we actually did pre-test these names to make sure they weren't viewed as different in any way. John and Jennifer as names are viewed as equally intelligent, likable, recognizable. So any differences in how science faculty are reacting to these profiles are due solely to the gender of the student. We're really quantifying sexism in this way, and not to any other superficial differences. And we find, I'm sorry to say, that the female student is viewed as significantly worse than the identical male student on every dimension that we thought to measure. So she's viewed as less competent, she's less likely to be hired, and she receives less critical career mentoring than the identical male student. So just merely as a function of her being female, we see this obstacle. I'll say that the gender of the faculty participants had no effect, so women are just as likely to show these biases as men, and we often find that in the literature. And I'll just say, I'll summarize a huge body of social science research, many of which is done by the folks in the room with us today, to say that other samples, other kinds of participants beyond science faculty and other job contexts show a lot of these same kinds of effects. So we have some pretty clear scientific evidence. But the question is, then what? Right? We've been running these studies for decades. What happens when people read about this kind of evidence? Does it change their minds? Punchline, no. But let me try to flesh out that no a little bit. So one study we ran, we thought this was a neat naturalistic opportunity to look at some real world data. What we did was we coded a large sample, over 800 comments that folks left online in response to media coverage of the study that I just showed you. So there's a New York Times article, a Washington Post article, and then an NPR article, and a couple of other outlets. We coded the comments that people, real folks, left online on those websites in reaction to reading about the study that I just showed you. Now, we noticed several different response categories, some positive, many negative. And for the purposes of our talk today, I would like to focus in with you on 3 of those categories. The first was what we termed sexist remarks. I would say this probably falls into the category that you folks mentioned, the old-fashioned sexism. And I'll just give you an example. Women aren't hired for a reason. I don't trust anything that bleeds for 5 days and doesn't die to make rational decisions. I would say that's fairly old-fashioned, blatant sexism. Not a lot of subtlety to that comment. And we saw many like this. Another category, which is really interesting, is folks who they're not denying that the bias is there, but they're trying to justify it. So yes, men are hired more frequently than women, but there's a good reason. So they would say things like, men are born smarter. If you believe that, you should probably hire the male applicant. It all boils down to unreliability. Men don't get women's problems, whatever those may be. Take that as you will. And then the last category was criticism of the research itself or the researchers who had run the study. So folks said things like, this report is junk science, there's no data here. Well, I did just show you the data, so there was some data at least. The study was flawed by the names. They should have picked names without obvious built-in affect, like Miles and Alice, or Charles and Marjorie. It's unlikely that the name Jennifer would have an aura of intellectual zap. So apologies to all the Jennifers in the room. Sorry. But as I told you, we did actually pretest those names, and we wrote about that in the paper. So this particular criticism is not of large concern. And then finally, the researchers are clearly activists driven by a feminist agenda. This is PCBS propaganda. So I would say these folks are probably not convinced of our evidence of sexism, but this is certainly not a controlled laboratory study, right? A neat sort of real-world opportunity to look at some data, but what we wanted to do next was move into the lab. So what we did here was expose folks from both the general population and science faculty to the abstract, again, of that first study that I showed you. And what we want to see is, might we see some gender differences in reactions to this study? So they read this abstract, and we simply asked them first let me just tell you that we saw a gender difference in those categories that I was just sharing with you. So here, the gray bars are the percent of those comment types, sexist remarks, justification of bias, and criticisms that were written by men relative to women. So we're seeing a fairly stark gender difference emerge in this likelihood of responding in a negative way to evidence of sexism. So what we want to see is, do we see the same kind of gender difference when we move into the lab? And so again, in this study, we are asking participants to simply read the abstract of that very first study that I told you about, the lab manager study. And we see among adults in the general population and STEM faculty, science, technology, engineering, mathematics faculty, we see the same gender difference, that men are rating that science as higher quality or as lower quality than women are, right? So men are more reactive, more critical of that actual science than are women from those same populations. So taking a step back to think about some implications or what we can really take from this. So first I would say that there's some suggestion here that there's a tendency to deny even fairly straightforward evidence of sexism, right? It's not as simple as just show people the data, teach them about this, and the problem will go away from there, right? And particularly men seem to be showing this pattern, at least in the data that we've looked at so far. And I would argue that this is really problematic for many reasons, one of which is that sexism itself presents a big enough obstacle to women's advancement. But denying sexism might present an even bigger obstacle, because that's how we move from blatant old-fashioned bias to just locker room talk, right? And when we think about this in more depth, the reason this is so sticky is because it sort of moves the problem, right, and the onus for change away from the people who are enacting sexism and onto the people who are identifying sexism or calling for change to address it, right? This is how we go from answering the question, why did Clinton lose? We could say, well, she faced staggering and unprecedented levels of bias and hostility. But when we characterize that as just locker room talk, then it becomes, well, she lost because Trump was the more qualified candidate. And then these patterns really are reified and perpetuated. So I would argue that figuring out ways to make it clear that sexism exists and impacts women's progress is one of our most important jobs. And I'm really looking forward to talking about that more with the panel. And the last thing I want to say is thinking about some next steps. Again, we were asked to figure out a way that women can win, and I think that that's more important than ever. And so one thing that I've been wrestling with in my work is, how do we confront sexism in a way that is palatable? Right, because we know that just simply publishing these data are not going to do the whole job for us. So we've developed some interventions in my lab. We partnered with artists, so a professional playwright and professional filmmakers. The playwright scripted a series of scenes that demonstrate the results of this kind of social science work in a way that we hoped would be more palatable and perhaps more lasting for folks watching those interventions. And we do find that in our work testing those videos, participants who've watched them, including science faculty members, are more likely to identify sexism in a new situation, label it as sexist and say that's not appropriate, than folks who haven't watched those films, or folks who've watched a more straightforward, traditional sort of academic presentation of those data. So we're excited about thinking about that as a way forward, and then thinking about translating that into other domains outside of academia. But now I'm really eager to turn it over to the rest of the panel. Thanks so much.
All right, we'll have a few minutes now of discussion among the panelists, and maybe we can concentrate on the question of where we go from here. We've had a number of different suggestions from women running for public office, women establishing leadership roles, and trying to intervene directly so that people will be more responsive to evidence. So I'd like to throw it open to the panel now and get your thoughts about the different suggestions that people have made, and then we'll go to the audience. It should be okay now.
Okay. Can you hear me? Perfect. Okay. So where to go from here? And I think participation is key. But it's also, we have to be very aware of the barriers that face women when they do try to participate. And one, as Laurie spoke about, was backlash. And that's huge, and it can be subtle. Backlash isn't always an active process. It can also be not helping a woman out. And there's also a phenomenon called subtyping, which is really important. And so when a woman reaches these higher ranks and has power and status, she's oftentimes labeled as an exception to the rule. And so increasing participation is key, and I think we need to do it all, a lot, and at the same time, and across all levels.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this question as I was listening to these talks, and I think it's very important to just be conscious of it in everyday situations. Like, we often hear friends saying, oh, she's hot, but she's crazy. And even those subtle types of language that we use and that we don't stop, I think it just gets into our psyche that that's normal. And we grow up like that, and then we reach college or professional life, and we think it's okay to harass women because you're gonna get away with it, or to speak about women or in a demeaning manner because they're not your mother or your sister. So I think it starts very early on, and it's a consistent process in an everyday, daily situations.
I've been thinking about this all my life, and I don't have the answer, except we have to raise women's status to be equal to men's. How best to do that is a huge challenge for this generation and coming generations. But the great thing about this election cycle is it has really woken people up. Like I said, this is unusual. For a long time, feminism had been the F word, right? And that's largely because young women thought two things. First, that the problem of overt, blatant sexism had been solved. And second of all, you know, we've gone so far with this feminism thing that it's starting to mess up our relationships with men. And when you have a confrontation between love and liberty, guess which wins, right? So I'm also trying to encourage my colleagues and everyone who is listening to us about this to start thinking about the ways in which, not love per se, but the way we teach our daughters and sons how men and women are supposed to be together in this world, romantic, heterosexual scripts included, fairy tale endings, and the whole 9 yards, how that can undermine women's sense of what their place in the world is, to be a helpmate to a man versus being independent and having direct access to power and resources yourself, right? So we need to kind of have a critical lens poured onto romantic ideologies. It's really going to help. I see a lot of nods, so that's good. It's hard. It's a tough one.
So I'll comment on the last presentation about you know, seeing it and saying something, and I think that's a very valuable tool to give people, because I think, you know, like racism, sexism is something that I think people are reluctant to talk about. So if you have these models, I guess, maybe what you're doing with the artists, for people to, right, how to have a conversation about these things, I think is valuable, because we need, at least I do, I think, right, ways to think about how we can talk about sexism. And so to see it modeled for us, I think, would probably increase the likelihood that people actually do say something. And then the comment about right, raising our daughters, and tying that to getting our daughters, I guess, to run for political office, because I think, right, we need to be encouraging our daughters to be doing that. This morning I was looking at some differential opinions that men and women in leadership positions hold in terms of the traits they exhibit and what traits we believe are important for running for political office. And the three main traits are confidence, competitiveness, and risk-taking. So for whatever reasons, all of the men compared to the women, they had an inflated or an overinflated sense of themselves, right? So they were more confident than women, and these were, right, women and men from the same, like, professional levels. And so the men scored higher on all of these traits, right? They had a greater sense of confidence, they were more competitive, and they showed greater propensity to take risks. And so, you know, in terms of thinking about how to encourage women or our daughters, I guess, to run for office, these are some of the traits. I don't know if they're all great traits, of course, but these are the traits that have been shown to propel at least more men than women to running for political office.
Corinne?
All right. So I'll close this question by saying just a tad more about that research in response to your thoughts. So we do have a website where all those videos are freely available for research purposes. And one thing that has really emerged while we've been doing that work is that the message when we talk about these sorts of biases is really critical, sort of how that message is framed, how it's contextualized for folks in terms of how reactive they get. So part of my life I spend giving talks about gender bias in STEM to STEM audiences. And as you would imagine, it's sometimes not the most popular message to deliver. And one thing that I've found that those audiences are always very surprised about is that we don't find a lot of demographic differences in terms of propensity to really enact bias at that first line level. So I told you that in our data, women are often just as likely as men to display these biases. And that really surprises those audiences and brings men to the table, I think, in a way that is important for us to think about, right? Because it sort of breaks down this perception that one group is fully to blame and that they're perhaps not welcome in terms of brainstorming this problem going forward. So we've tried to think a lot about how we can communicate these results in a way that is palatable and action-oriented. And I think further research is needed to really figure out how to do that. But it does seem to be a critical piece of this that we have to consider. It's not enough to just show that these biases exist. We have to figure out how that message can land with people in a way that makes them willing and wanting to move forward.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on one thing the panel talked about, namely what psychologists have now called bystander effects. So you are often a bystander, as it were. That is, you're in a room where something that shouldn't be happening is happening. And there's training to try to help people learn how to intervene in those daily situations. So when you see something, how can you bring it to people's attention in a way that will not alienate them or make them feel uselessly guilty, but will make them willing to take some responsibility for what they're saying. A small thing that one of my colleagues decided to do, because he thought that women, when they talked in faculty meetings, were not being paid attention to as much as men were. He decided that when he saw that happen, what he would do is say, if I could rephrase what Susan said, I think that she was saying X, Y, and Z, so that then people would talk about it and not have the discussion go on as if Susan had never existed. So there are very small things that one can do on a daily basis that will increase the likelihood that women's voices are being heard. And I'd encourage you all to think about how you can do that in your everyday lives. Now, wonderfully, there are a whole lot of hands going up. So I'm going to let everybody who wants to talk ask a question. So if I hear you giving a speech, I am going to stop you right away. So you have to actually ask a question. The very first thing you say has to be a question with a question mark at the end of it. All right.
This all sounds great, but how do we pull, there's a question mark. Let's start with how. How do we pull women up? So I want to run. I took Ready to Run at Newark on the last weekend. But I'm constantly told, get in line. And so how do we break the line? Because there aren't enough women in the city council. I am intending to run for city council, but there aren't enough women. We don't have a single woman right now running for mayor. How do we break the lock to let women, I'm ready. I've got all the qualities. The hearing access you see here, that was me. All the hearing access around New York, I've got all the qualities. But how do I break the lock that says, get in line?
Okay, does anybody want to take that on? The reading that I've done in the political science literature and things that are in your insert suggests that the Democratic Party is more open to women than the Republican Party. If you just look at the numbers, that's the case. But there is a real problem with both parties of not encouraging women to run. So one interpretation of the data that Charles referred to is the reason women win at the same rates as men is that they're overqualified compared to the men. They're more highly selected than the men are. That may or may not be the case. But what does someone like this woman do? Charles, do you want to make a very quick stab at it?
Sure. So first of all, I would encourage you to just do it, meaning that, right, forget about the line. And one reason I want to encourage you to do that is because over the course of the last 40, 50 years, the nature of campaigns has changed from being what we call party-centered campaigns to candidate-centered campaigns, meaning that in the past, parties played a large role in determining who ran and who won. So parties provided volunteers, provided fundraising assistance, providing advising, but that's no longer the case. So candidates have to do it on their own these days, right? So you have to raise your own money, you have to find your own support structure, your own volunteers, hire your own pollsters, hire your own advisors. So candidates are less beholden to the party elders or the people telling you to get in line. So once you win, all of those resources that they talk about having and holding over you will flow your way. Yeah,
Right,
money
okay.
and support. And the other thing would be open seats, right? So incumbency has an outsized factor in electoral politics, meaning that it's almost impossible to beat an incumbent. So if you are facing a situation where there's an open seat, I would say jump in. If you're facing a situation where you have to take on an incumbent, you might have an advantage in that very few people will step up and challenge the incumbent. So right, in terms of providing a clear field for you to make that challenge, you might have a better opportunity. But I will warn you that name recognition is something that incumbents have that's very difficult to overcome. So unless you've got like a last name that's related to, maybe you're a star or a local celebrity, challenges are going to be great. But I would still encourage you to do it.
And raising money, and if people stay in their seats, especially in some of the congressional members, don't leave.
Right.
It creates a landlock, and you
Right.
can't move up. The pipeline is closed, and this is the problem of why women can't run. So all the statistics, but you need.
But
open
name recognition is very
Okay.
important. So
Okay.
if you run and you lose,
Stop.
you've
Stop.
increased your name
Stop.
recognition.
All right, and I'll point everybody to a site at Rutgers, cawp.com. If you just put in CAWP, you'll get it. And there are a lot of suggestions in there about how to support women like this woman who want to run for office. So I encourage you to look at that because she can't do it by herself. So in the back, and you'll get a microphone. And remember, ask a question.
So how do you get women to support other women? Because I'm already running for city council, and one of the challenges I found, yes, hi, I'm Bessie Schachter. I'm running for city council in this neighborhood. I live a few blocks away. One of the biggest challenges I've found is that the backlash that I get for being a candidate and for being willing to run is actually from women. I have endorsements from many men, and from what I hear from women is, why do you have to bring your daughter to an event? Why do you have to feel like showing off things that are feminine qualities? The women themselves judge me negatively for that, as you could see by the fact that women voted for Trump. So how do you respond to that concern?
Great, thank you. Who would like to address that on our panel?
Well, I did the backlash part of it, so I'll talk about the fact that I guess this is empathizing with you. When I was doing my thesis research on backlash, I had people interview a live, we call them Confederates, a man and a woman. They had back-to-back interviews, and their goal was to hire the best person for the job. And if that person did well at the task they were being hired for, the participant could make $100, okay? So we gave them a financial incentive. And that's the only time I've ever found a gender difference in my research. Men were about 50-50 likely to choose the gal or the guy. They were very self-promoting and confident and assertive about their ability to do the task. And men responded by saying, oh, okay, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Not a single woman chose the woman. 100% chose the man. And I was sitting there sort of stunned because it's that moment when your feminism collides with your science. And you realize that what you'd like to see as a feminist is not what you always see as a scientist. And so I did a follow-up study where I had women, I just talked to them afterwards, and why, what was the problem with this? And they said, yuck. Okay, so that I've been trying to translate yuck all this time, right? What is it? What's the yucky part, right? And boy, it's a dominance penalty. If you come on as a confident, competitive, all the things you need to be a political leader, people think that you are a dominatrix, right? I mean, you just way over priced yourself on the dominance scale, and that's part of the problem. And by dominance, I'm talking about arrogant, dominant, controlling, self-centered, because the things we value women for are all the things we don't value leaders for. And that's where we get into that intersection of love and power again, and what it is that women are supposed to be good at. And it's not telling other people what to do. It's not coming up with brilliant ideas for policy decisions. It's by supporting other people. We have to break that lock that we have on the way we think about men and women.
Thank you. Yes.
Could you make some comparison of the American situation with some other leaders in the world? So I'm thinking in particular of Angela Merkel, who is undoubtedly one of the most powerful women in the world, but her nickname is Mutti, mother. And I'm thinking of Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, who won in a party competition against another woman who had criticized Theresa May for not having children. That is, she made the opponent made a sexist comment, and the utterer of the sexist comment lost in that situation. The more powerful seeming woman without the children won. So I'm wondering whether British politics, obviously those are party leaders rather than directly elected leaders as we have in the United States. But I wonder if you could make some comment about America versus other leaders in the world.
I know from my German friends that Angela Merkel is also, when they refer to her in the media there, they use it. It's the gender-free pronoun. She's not a she or a he, she's an it. Yeah. So maybe they call her mother in a facetious kind of way, I'm not sure. Oh, it's an affectionate. But what's up with the it? Oh, really? Wow. Huh. Oh, okay. So they think it's bad, though. These female German researchers feel like it's a sign that they can't accept a woman in power, therefore she becomes gender-free. Right.
All right, so perhaps our panel doesn't actually have any light to shed on this particular
Not this issue, yeah.
Okay. So, yes.
We've been talking about women, but when do we start teaching girls to be confident, aggressive, able to do all the things that men can do? When do we start, and how?
Sure, I think that's such an important question for us to grapple with right now. So some new work in my lab is looking at the extent to which we observe people administering backlash towards kids who violate gender stereotypes. So this panel's done a ton of work on backlash against adults, not as much as looked at backlash against kids. So far, what we're finding on the part of daycare workers as well as sort of general folks in the population is that there are a lot harsher rules and penalties for breaking them for little boys than there are for little girls. So there's more of a, oh, tomboy, that's fine, much stricter line for boys. So the way that we would think about some next steps in terms of teaching girls, unfortunately, there's some similar situation than there is to adults, that we can't just encourage women to lean in when we know they're leaning into horrifying backlash. But when we think about kids, I think it's just as important to think about how do we teach our boys to be expressing their true selves. And when we understand that when we liberate both boys and girls and men and women to express themselves and live to their full potential, then we're all benefiting from that. And I think that the data so far for kids are that the boys are really on the front lines of negative reactions.
And how do little girls react to that? They look at that and they say, oh, he wants to play with my doll, and then people are shaming him. So everyone is learning, both boys and girls, that what you don't want to be is a girl.
Yeah.
Because the status of boys is so high, so much higher, that they have to protect it regardless of the feelings of that boy.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes, we do. Let's talk.
And to fix women, we have to fix men. Absolutely. Yep.
I am calling on one right this second.
Hi. Yeah, my pronouns are he, him, his. I have a question. So it sounds like what we've heard is there's a lot of data that supports this idea of sexism. Then moving forward, you've done research. So would you say that there are any, from like policy standpoints, any government agencies, what could they do as far as enacting policies that seem to generate a lot of backlash? And are there any movements or any initiatives that you've seen that have been effective, even if they aren't politically popular?
I can answer. Well, I have a thought on that, if people don't mind. Paid parental leave. Yeah. I mean, so I say this as a psychologist, right? I'm not a public policy person, but when you think about how we learn these rules, how everyone learns these rules, if one person is able to stay home in the first days of a child's life and one person isn't, who's going to become the keeper of the knowledge about the child? And who's going to teach that child who's home and who's not, right? If all of our kids are seeing just mom home in the beginning and dad can't be home and can't learn how to bond with that kid or how to care for that child, then we've lost before we've started. So I don't think we know it's not popular, right? We're one of only 3 countries in the world that doesn't have mandated paid maternity leave, let alone parental leave. But I think from my vantage point, the single most impactful policy change we could make is paid parental leave for all partners.
Thank you. Okay, one more question. Yes.
I would like you, Professor, to expand on why racism was the #1 reason that Hillary lost.
Briefly. All right, briefly. Let me just say that it's one of the reasons she lost, right? Maybe not the main, but the point was that it was one thing that helped explain the vote. Some believe that race is the dividing line in American politics, always. And that when you're talking about, policies, when you're talking about welfare, when you're talking about taxes, when you're talking about health care, you're really talking about race. And so, I think that, for a variety of reasons for our country's history, that race has been such a prominent issue, that it's, that it determines our political decisions and behaviors, whether we know it or not sometimes.
Yes.
What keeps me up at night following this election is the fact that we did not reach those women who live in that class chasm, are subjugated by men and most affected by their husband or the men in their lives' votes, because for class reasons. I would submit that class played the biggest role in the loss of Hillary Clinton in this election. And I want to know if any of the research is addressing how we communicate with women who are subjugated, who don't have a voice, who weren't heard, who weren't talked to enough in this election. That would have made the difference. Or is there any research being done along those lines?
Thank you. Okay, this is the last answer.
An answer to nothing.
No,
Yeah, okay.
there is not research on that yet, but it's coming. Because once this election, we were complacent. Everyone figured there was no way that he could win. I was confident that he wasn't going to win. Let's put it that way. Right. 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 But there's already a really good book out, Strangers in Their Own Land. Have you check that one out. Arlie Hochschild, yeah.
Yeah, that's
She's-
one of the books
Yep.
that's listed among the reading and the insert.
Yes, and she's inspiring all kinds of research on that topic. So it's coming. We're in
Psycholo-
early days.
Yeah, psychologists typically have not investigated class as much as they've investigated race and gender. And so that's a real empty spot that needs to be filled. Okay, I regret to say that this wonderful discussion has to come to an end. I am so happy that so many of you came and were such wonderful participants.